The morning sun barely pierced through the thick clouds hanging over the military base as Sarah Mitchell walked toward the training grounds. Her boots made soft crunching sounds against the gravel path. She had been with the Special Forces unit for 3 years now, earning every stripe on her uniform through blood, sweat, and countless hours of pushing her body beyond what she thought was possible. At 28 years old, she stood at 5 feet 6 inches, with lean muscles that spoke of discipline rather than bulk. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her green eyes held a determined focus that had become her signature look. The other soldiers on the base had learned to respect Sarah, though it hadn't come easily. When she first arrived, many of the men questioned whether a woman belonged in their elite unit. They watched her struggle through the initial training exercises, waiting for her to quit. But Sarah never gave them that satisfaction. She ran faster, trained harder, and studied combat techniques until her movements became second nature. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Henderson, had been one of her few supporters from the beginning. He saw something in her that reminded him of the best soldiers he had ever trained, a quiet determination that couldn't be broken by physical pain or mental exhaustion. Today was supposed to be a routine weapon maintenance day. Sarah loved these quieter moments when she could focus on the technical aspects of her job. She entered the armory, a large concrete building with rows of locked cabinets containing various weapons and equipment. The smell of gun oil and metal filled her nostrils as she signed in with the duty officer, Sergeant Marcus Price. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s with graying hair and a permanent scowl that made new recruits nervous. But Sarah knew him well enough to see past the rough exterior. He nodded at her and gestured toward her assigned station. Sarah retrieved her rifle, a weapon she had carried through 2 overseas deployments. She knew every scratch on its surface, every slight imperfection in the stock. Cleaning and maintaining it was almost meditative for her. She settled at her workstation and began the familiar process of disassembly. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, laying out each component in precise order. The quiet rhythm of her work was interrupted only by the occasional sound of other soldiers moving through the building. About an hour into her maintenance routine, the atmosphere in the armory shifted. Sarah felt it before she saw anything wrong. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the usual background chatter among the soldiers died down. She looked up from her work to see 5 men entering through the main door. They weren't in uniform, which was unusual for this secure area of the base. They wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, and jackets that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. Something about their body language set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. Sergeant Price stood up from his desk, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. But before he could react, one of the intruders pulled out a weapon and fired. The shot echoed through the concrete building like thunder. Price dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers as he gasped in pain. The other soldiers in the armory froze for a split second, their training warring with the shock of seeing an attack on their own base. Sarah's body reacted before her mind fully processed what was happening. She dropped behind her workstation, her partially disassembled rifle useless in front of her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her breathing remained controlled. Years of training had prepared her for high-stress situations, and that training kicked in automatically. She heard the intruders shouting commands, ordering everyone to get down on the ground. Their voices had foreign accents she couldn't immediately place, but their intentions were clear. This was an attack, somehow executed right in the heart of a secure military facility. The lead intruder, a tall man with cold blue eyes and a scar running down his left cheek, surveyed the room with predatory confidence. He barked orders to his companions in a language Sarah didn't recognize. 2 of them moved quickly to secure the doors, effectively trapping everyone inside. Another began collecting weapons from the soldiers, tossing rifles and sidearms into a large duffel bag. The 5th man kept his weapon trained on the group of soldiers who had complied with the order to lie face down on the floor. Sarah remained behind her workstation, her mind racing through possibilities. She counted the intruders again. 5 men, all armed. At least a dozen soldiers in the building, but most of them had been caught completely off guard. Sergeant Price was injured and needed medical attention soon. The intruders seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they wanted. This wasn't a random attack. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with military precision. The lead intruder's eyes swept across the room and landed on Sarah's position. A cold smile spread across his face as he gestured with his weapon for her to come out. Sarah slowly stood up, raising her hands to show they were empty. Her rifle lay in pieces on the table, completely useless. The man's smile widened as he noticed this. He said something to one of his companions, and they both laughed. Sarah understood the mockery even without knowing their language. To them, she was just another soldier caught unprepared, especially vulnerable without her weapon. As Sarah stepped away from her workstation with her hands raised, she took in every detail of the situation. The exits were blocked. The intruders were focused but not panicked, suggesting they had confidence in their plan. The other soldiers remained on the ground, some watching her with fear in their eyes, others keeping their faces pressed to the floor as instructed. Her training had covered hostage situations, but always from the perspective of being the rescuer, not the hostage. The lead intruder approached her with casual confidence. He was at least 6 feet tall and built like someone who spent considerable time in the gym. His weapon remained pointed at her chest as he closed the distance between them. He reached out with his free hand and grabbed Sarah's rifle from the table, examining it briefly before tossing it to one of his companions. Then he turned his attention back to Sarah, his cold eyes studying her with what seemed like amusement. He spoke in heavily accented English. "Pretty soldier girl. No gun now. Not so tough, yes?" His companions laughed again, emboldened by their apparent control of the situation. Sarah remained silent, her face neutral, showing neither fear nor defiance. She had learned long ago that emotional displays were often liabilities in combat situations. Instead, she used the moment to observe, to gather information, to wait for any opportunity that might present itself. The intruder circled around her slowly, like a predator assessing prey. Sarah could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes and noticed the slight tremor in his non-weapon hand, possibly from adrenaline or drugs. These details registered automatically in her mind, filed away for potential use. Her muscles remained relaxed but ready, her breathing steady despite the spike of fear that tried to claw its way up her throat. Outside the armory, the base continued its normal operations, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding inside. Sarah knew that eventually, someone would notice something was wrong. But how long would that take? And what would these intruders do before help arrived? As the lead intruder completed his circle around her, Sarah caught Sergeant Price's eye from where he lay bleeding on the floor. Despite his pain, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of trust and encouragement. Whatever happened next, she knew she couldn't just stand by and wait for rescue. The tension in the armory was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah stood perfectly still as the lead intruder completed his assessment of her. His companions had finished collecting weapons from the other soldiers and were now discussing something among themselves in their foreign language. Their body language suggested disagreement about what to do next. One of them, a shorter man with nervous eyes, kept glancing toward the doors as if worried about discovery. Sarah's military training had included extensive study of human behavior under stress. She recognized the signs of a plan beginning to unravel. The intruders had clearly expected this operation to go smoothly, but Sergeant Price's resistance and injury had introduced an unpredictable element. Now they were inside a locked armory on a military base with injured personnel and a dozen witnesses. Their original plan, whatever it was, had complications. The lead intruder seemed to reach a decision. He shouted orders to his men, his voice sharp with authority. 2 of them moved to start loading equipment into additional bags they had brought. Sarah realized with growing alarm what they were after. This wasn't just an attack. It was a theft operation targeting military weapons and equipment. These men planned to steal from the armory and somehow escape the base with their haul. One of the intruders approached Sarah with zip ties, clearly intending to restrain her hands. This was a critical moment, and Sarah knew it. Once restrained, her options would become extremely limited. But if she resisted now, with all 5 men alert and armed, the outcome would likely be deadly for her and possibly for the other soldiers in the room. She forced herself to remain calm, to wait, to trust in her training that told her opportunities come to those who stay patient and aware. The man roughly grabbed her wrists and began securing the zip tie. Sarah didn't resist but paid close attention to how tightly he fastened it and at what angle. These details might matter later. As he finished, he shoved her toward the other soldiers on the floor. Sarah dropped to her knees, positioning herself near Sergeant Price. Up close, she could see his face had gone pale from blood loss. The shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening if he got medical attention soon. Price whispered so quietly that Sarah barely heard him. Communication device. My left pocket. His eyes flickered toward his injured side. Sarah understood immediately. If she could get that device, she could call for help. But it was on his left side, the same side as his wound. And any attempt to reach for it now would be noticed by the intruders who were watching the group of soldiers carefully. The intruders worked quickly, grabbing specific weapons and equipment with a precision that confirmed they had detailed knowledge of what the armory contained. Someone had provided them with inside information about the base layout, security protocols, and the armory's inventory. This realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine. There was a traitor somewhere in the command structure, someone who had enabled this attack. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's mind worked through scenarios and possibilities. The base had regular security patrols, and the armory would be expecting check-ins from Sergeant Price. When he failed to respond, alarms would be raised. But how long would that take? 15 minutes? 30? An hour? And what would these intruders do when they heard sirens approaching? Would they try to fight their way out, potentially killing everyone in the armory to eliminate witnesses? One of the intruders, the nervous one who kept watching the doors, suddenly spoke urgently to the leader. Sarah caught a few words that sounded like warnings about time. The leader snapped back at him, clearly frustrated but also aware that their window was closing. They began moving faster, less carefully. One of them knocked over a display of ammunition boxes, sending rounds scattering across the concrete floor with metallic pings. Sarah saw her first opportunity. In the momentary distraction of the dropped ammunition, she shifted her position slightly, moving closer to Sergeant Price's left side. The movement was subtle, just a few inches, but it brought her within reach of his pocket. She kept her eyes down, her posture submissive, giving no indication that she had any plan beyond following their orders. The intruders began arguing among themselves more openly now. Their voices rose, though they tried to keep their dispute quiet. Sarah's years of observing people in high-stress situations told her what was happening. The team was fracturing under pressure. The nervous one wanted to abort and escape while they still could. Another seemed to want to complete the mission regardless of risk. The leader was caught between maintaining control of his team and adapting to circumstances that had gone off script. This internal conflict among the intruders was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. In any combat situation, the moment when an enemy's attention is divided is the moment to act. She had learned this principle in countless training exercises and had applied it during her deployments overseas. But this situation was different. She wasn't armed with her rifle, wasn't wearing protective gear, and wasn't backed up by her unit. She was on her own with only her bare hands and her training. Sarah's hand moved slowly, incrementally toward Sergeant Price's pocket. She kept her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on the floor, every muscle in her body ready to freeze if one of the intruders looked her way. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of Price's uniform. She could feel the slight bulge of the communication device inside, just a few more inches. The argument among the intruders escalated. The leader grabbed the nervous one by his jacket and shoved him against the wall. The other three intruders turned to watch this confrontation, their weapons lowering slightly as their focus shifted from the hostages to their internal dispute. This was the moment. Sarah's fingers closed around the communication device and carefully extracted it from Price's pocket. She palmed the device against her leg, hiding it from view. Her heart raced, but her hands remained steady. The device was small, probably a short-range radio that could reach the base security office. But she couldn't activate it yet. The sound would immediately alert the intruders, and they would take it from her before she could transmit any useful information. She needed a better moment, a bigger distraction. The leader released the nervous intruder with a final shove and barked orders at everyone. His patience was clearly exhausted. He wanted the operation completed immediately. Two of the men went back to loading equipment, working with frantic speed. The other two positioned themselves to watch the hostages more carefully. Sarah noticed that despite their increased vigilance, they were showing signs of fatigue and stress. Their movements had become slightly less precise, their focus more scattered. Sarah began planning her next move. She had the communication device, but activating it would be like lighting a fuse. Once she made that call, everything would happen fast. The intruders would realize help was coming and would have to make immediate decisions about whether to fight, flee, or negotiate. Any of those options could end in bloodshed, but doing nothing was equally dangerous. Every minute that passed increased the risk that these men would decide to eliminate witnesses or take hostages with them. She looked around at the other soldiers on the floor. Most of them were young, some barely out of training. They trusted her, she realized. They were looking to her for guidance, for hope, for some sign that this nightmare would end. Sarah had never wanted the responsibility of leadership, but it had found her anyway. These people's lives depended on the decisions she made in the next few minutes. Sergeant Price met her eyes again. Despite his pain and blood loss, he managed a small, encouraging nod. He had seen her take the device. He knew she was planning something. His expression said he trusted her judgment, whatever she decided to do. That trust felt heavy, like a physical weight on Sarah's shoulders. But it also strengthened her resolve. The intruders finished loading their bags. The leader did a final check of the weapons they had collected, clearly satisfied with their haul. Then he turned his attention to the hostages. His cold blue eyes swept across the group, and Sarah saw him making calculations. What to do with witnesses, how to ensure their escape. His hand tightened on his weapon, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She had seen that look before, on the faces of enemy combatants who were preparing to do something terrible. She had run out of time. Whatever she was going to do, it had to be now. Sarah's fingers wrapped around the communication device hidden against her leg. The leader's expression had shifted from confident control to something darker, more dangerous. She had seen enough combat to recognize when someone was about to make a fatal decision. The way he looked at the hostages wasn't the look of someone planning to leave witnesses alive. Time had run out for patience and waiting. In one fluid motion, Sarah activated the communication device and shouted into it. Code Red Armory breach, multiple hostiles, officer down. Her voice carried the sharp authority of someone trained to give commands under fire. The response was immediate and came from multiple directions at once. The intruders spun toward her, shock and anger on their faces. The leader raised his weapon, his finger moving toward the trigger. But Sarah was already moving. 3 years of hand-to-hand combat training, countless hours in the gym, and 2 combat deployments had honed her body into a weapon that didn't require bullets. She exploded upward from her kneeling position with a speed that caught everyone off guard. Her first target was the closest intruder, the nervous one who had been doubting the mission from the start. His weapon was lowered, his attention scattered by the sudden chaos. Sarah's strike was precise and devastating. Her right hand shot out in a palm strike that connected with his throat. The impact crushed his windpipe, and he dropped his weapon as both hands flew to his neck. He made a choking, gasping sound as he collapsed to his knees. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds. The other intruders reacted, but they were reacting to Sarah's actions rather than anticipating them. In combat, this difference between action and reaction provides a crucial advantage measured in fractions of seconds. Sarah used those fractions ruthlessly. She grabbed the falling man's weapon before it hit the ground and swung it like a club at the second nearest intruder. The metal stock connected with his temple with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back and he crumpled to the floor unconscious. 4 seconds. The leader shouted something in his language, a mix of command and warning. He was trying to bring his weapon to bear on Sarah, but she was already inside his effective range. One of the fundamental principles of close-quarters combat is that once an opponent gets inside your weapon's minimum range, the weapon becomes a liability rather than an asset. Sarah had closed that distance before he could adjust. She grabbed his weapon with both hands, her fingers wrapping around the barrel. The metal was hot from earlier firing. Sarah ignored the pain and used her body weight and leverage to twist the weapon upward, breaking his grip and his trigger finger in the process. He screamed in pain and rage. Sarah brought her knee up hard into his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, she struck down with both hands, still gripping his weapon, smashing it into the back of his neck. He went down hard. 7 seconds. The 2 remaining intruders had finally processed what was happening and were bringing their weapons to bear. But the soldiers on the floor, inspired by Sarah's action, were also moving now. The element of surprise had shifted. 3 soldiers rushed the intruder on the left, tackling him before he could fire. His weapon discharged into the ceiling, showering them with concrete dust, but no one was hit. The final intruder, seeing his entire operation collapse around him in seconds, made a desperate decision to run. He turned toward the nearest door, abandoning his companions and the mission. Sarah couldn't let him escape to potentially alert whoever had helped them plan this attack. She launched herself across the room in pursuit. Her hands were still bound with zip ties, but adrenaline and determination drove her forward. She caught him just as he reached the door, grabbing him by his jacket. He spun, trying to bring his weapon around. Sarah's bound hands were actually an advantage here. She brought both fists together in a double hammer strike that caught him under the chin. His head snapped back and she followed with a knee strike to his midsection. He was bigger and stronger than her, and he fought with the desperation of a trapped animal. His elbow caught her in the ribs, sending a spike of pain through her side. But pain was just information, something her instructors had drilled into her during training. She processed it and moved past it. Her training had prepared her for this level of physical combat, for fighting when injured, for pushing through pain barriers that would stop most people. She swept his legs, and they both went down. On the ground, Sarah used her legs to control his body, wrapping them around his torso in a position that restricted his movement. Her bound hands became a weapon again, delivering short, powerful strikes to vulnerable points. His nose broke with a wet crunch. Blood poured down his face. He tried to reach for his weapon, but Sarah's leg snaked out and kicked it away. The fight lasted only seconds more. Sarah maintained her position, continuing to strike until his resistance faded and he stopped fighting. When she was certain he was no longer a threat, she rolled off him, gasping for breath. Her ribs screamed where his elbow had connected. Her hands were bleeding from the tight zip ties cutting into her wrists. 12 seconds had passed since she activated the communication device. 85 seconds total from the moment she first moved until the last intruder was subdued. The armory erupted in activity. The other soldiers were securing the intruders, using their own zip ties to restrain them. Someone found scissors and cut Sarah's bindings. Blood rushed back into her hands with painful intensity. Another soldier was applying pressure to Sergeant Price's wound, keeping him stable until medical help arrived. The sound of sirens filled the air outside. Within moments, the armory doors burst open and security forces flooded in, weapons drawn, ready for a firefight. They found instead a scene of aftermath. 5 intruders lay on the ground, either unconscious, injured, or restrained. Sarah sat against the wall, cradling her ribs and trying to catch her breath. The other soldiers were checking each other for injuries and securing the area. The base commander, Colonel Henderson, arrived minutes later. He took in the scene with experienced eyes, quickly piecing together what had happened. His gaze fell on Sarah, sitting against the wall with blood on her hands and a bruise forming on her face. Around her lay 5 men who had thought they could simply walk into a military armory and take what they wanted. Henderson had seen combat in 3 different wars. He had witnessed extraordinary acts of courage and skill throughout his career. But what Sarah had just done, defending her fellow soldiers while unarmed and restrained, taking down 5 armed men in a minute and a half with nothing but her bare hands and her training, was something that would be talked about for years to come. Medical personnel rushed in and began treating the wounded. Sergeant Price was quickly stabilized and prepared for transport to the base hospital. The intruders received medical attention as well, though under armed guard. Sarah tried to wave off the medic who approached her, insisting she was fine, but he was insistent. Her ribs were bruised, possibly cracked. Her wrists had deep cuts from the zip ties. She had various contusions and abrasions from the brief but intense fight. As the medic worked on her, Sarah watched the controlled chaos around her. Military police were documenting everything, taking statements, photographing evidence. The intelligence officers had already arrived, no doubt concerned about how these intruders had gotten onto the base and into the armory. There would be investigations, debriefings, reviews of security protocols, but for now, in this moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel the relief of having survived. Her hands were shaking, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. She had acted on instinct and training, doing what needed to be done without hesitation. Only now did her mind catch up to what her body had accomplished. One of the other soldiers, a young private named Torres who had been on the floor during the attack, approached Sarah carefully. His eyes were wide with something between awe and disbelief. He started to say something, stumbled over his words, then simply said, "Thank you, ma'am. You saved our lives." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The weight of what had just happened was settling on her shoulders. She had saved lives today, but she had also hurt people badly, possibly killed the first intruder she had struck. These were consequences she would have to live with, decisions that would replay in her mind during quiet moments for years to come. The base hospital smelled of antiseptic and floor cleaner, a sterile environment that felt worlds away from the chaos of the armory just hours earlier. Sarah sat on an examination table while a doctor wrapped her ribs with tight bandages. The X-rays had confirmed what she already knew from the sharp pain with each breath. 3 ribs were cracked, not broken completely, but damaged enough to make every movement uncomfortable. Her wrists were bandaged where the zip ties had cut into her skin, and she had a collection of bruises that would turn spectacular shades of purple and yellow over the coming days. Colonel Henderson stood in the corner of the examination room, waiting patiently while the medical staff finished their work. His expression was unreadable, a practiced neutrality that came from decades of military service. Sarah couldn't tell if he was angry, impressed, or concerned. Probably all 3, she thought. When the doctor finally stepped back and gave Sarah permission to put her shirt back on, she moved slowly, wincing at the protest from her ribs. Henderson dismissed the medical staff with a polite nod, and suddenly, Sarah was alone with her commanding officer. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Henderson finally spoke, his voice quiet and measured. "I've read the preliminary reports from the scene. Every witness says the same thing. You took down 5 armed men in 85 seconds while your hands were bound." He paused, studying her face. "That's not standard training, Mitchell. That's something else entirely." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I did what I was trained to do, sir. Protect my fellow soldiers. Your training didn't cover taking on 5 armed attackers by yourself," Henderson countered. "Your training covered waiting for backup, following protocols, staying safe until the cavalry arrived. What you did today went so far beyond training that I'm not even sure what to call it." Sarah felt a flash of uncertainty. Was she being reprimanded? Had she violated some protocol by acting instead of waiting? The thought hadn't even occurred to her in the moment. She had seen the danger, recognized the narrowing window of opportunity, and acted. Second-guessing hadn't been an option. Henderson must have seen the confusion on her face because his expression softened slightly. "I'm not criticizing you, Mitchell. I'm trying to understand how one soldier accomplished what you did today. The base psychologist wants to evaluate you. The intelligence officers want to debrief you extensively. The press officers want to know how much of this story they can release to the media, and I want to know if you're okay." The last statement caught Sarah off guard. Henderson wasn't usually the type for personal concern. He was a good commander, fair and competent, but he maintained professional distance. This sudden glimpse of genuine care reminded Sarah that underneath the uniform and rank he was human too. "I'm okay, sir," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Her body hurt, certainly, but there was something else, a lingering unease that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I keep replaying it in my mind. The first man I hit, the one whose throat I struck. Is he going to survive?" Henderson's expression grew even more serious. "He's in critical condition. They're flying him to a specialized facility. The doctors say it could go either way." He paused, letting that information sink in. "You need to understand something, Mitchell. What you did was justified. You were protecting yourself and your fellow soldiers from armed intruders who had already shot Sergeant Price and were clearly preparing to do worse. Whatever happens to that man, the responsibility lies with him and his choice to attack a military installation." Sarah nodded, but Henderson's words didn't completely ease the knot in her stomach. She had hurt someone badly, possibly fatally, and even though it was justified, even though she would do it again if faced with the same situation, the reality of it was harder to process than she had anticipated. Over the next few days, Sarah's world became a blur of debriefings and interviews. Military intelligence officers questioned her for hours about every detail she could remember. What did the intruders say? What language were they speaking? Did she notice any identifying marks or tattoos? How did they move? What kind of weapons training did they appear to have? The investigation revealed disturbing information. The intruders were part of a larger organization that had been targeting military installations across multiple countries. They had inside help from a civilian contractor who worked on the base and had access to security schedules and armory inventories. That contractor was now in custody, facing charges of treason and conspiracy. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in how the intruders had reacted when Sarah fought back. Apparently, these men had successfully raided 2 other facilities in different countries without encountering serious resistance. They had become overconfident, expecting military personnel to freeze when confronted with unexpected violence. Sarah's immediate and effective counterattack had disrupted their entire operational model. News of the armory incident spread quickly through the base and then beyond. Despite the command's attempts to keep details classified for security reasons, word leaked out. Sarah found herself the subject of intense attention and speculation. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before sought her out to shake her hand or express their respect. Some looked at her with something approaching awe, as if she were somehow superhuman rather than just a well-trained soldier who had acted under pressure. The attention made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. She had never sought recognition or fame. She had joined the military to serve, to challenge herself, to be part of something larger than her individual life. This sudden spotlight felt wrong, as if people were celebrating violence rather than understanding the complex reality of what had happened in that armory. Sergeant Price recovered from his shoulder wound and made a point of visiting Sarah in her quarters. He knocked on her door late one evening, his arm in a sling, but otherwise looking healthy. When she let him in, he stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "Not just for helping me, but for making the hard call. You could have waited for backup, played it safe. But you saw what I saw in that leader's eyes. He was going to start executing hostages to speed up his escape. You stopped him before he could pull that trigger." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, the first real emotion she had allowed herself to feel since the incident. "I was terrified," she admitted quietly. "The whole time, I was absolutely terrified." Price nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "That's what courage is, Mitchell. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Any idiot can be fearless. It takes real strength to be afraid and still do what needs to be done." They talked, for another hour, 2 soldiers processing trauma in the only way they knew how, by sharing the burden with someone who understood. Price had been in combat before, had seen and done things that haunted him. He helped Sarah understand that what she was feeling, the strange mix of pride and guilt and fear and relief, was normal. It was the mark of someone who took their responsibilities seriously, who understood the weight of their actions. As the days turned into a week, Sarah slowly began to find her equilibrium again. The physical injuries were healing, though her ribs would need several more weeks before she could return to full training. The psychological impact was harder to measure and would take longer to process completely. The base psychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, had been checking in with Sarah regularly. She was a calm, intelligent woman in her 50s who had spent years helping soldiers deal with combat trauma. During their sessions, she helped Sarah understand that her response to the incident was entirely normal for someone who had experienced acute life-threatening stress. "You're going to have moments where you replay the incident," Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. "You'll think about what you could have done differently, whether you used too much force or not enough. These thoughts are your mind's way of processing and integrating the experience. They don't mean you did anything wrong, they mean you're human." Sarah appreciated Dr. Chen's straightforward approach. Too many people were treating her like either a hero or a victim, neither of which felt accurate. Dr. Chen treated her like a professional who had done a difficult job under extreme circumstances and was now dealing with the natural consequences of that experience. Meanwhile, the investigation into the armory attack continued to unfold. Military intelligence had traced the criminal organization back to its origins and discovered it had been operating for nearly 5 years, stealing military equipment and selling it to the highest bidder. The attack on Sarah's base had been their most ambitious operation yet, and its spectacular failure had caused their entire network to collapse as members turned on each other in an attempt to avoid prosecution. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah received orders to report to Colonel Henderson's office. She walked across the base with a measured pace, her ribs still tender but healing well. The bruises on her face had faded to faint yellow shadows, barely noticeable unless someone looked closely. Physically, she was recovering. Emotionally, she was still working through the layers of what had happened. The base had settled into a new normal. Security had been dramatically increased at all entry points in sensitive areas. The civilian contractor who had aided the intruders was facing a military tribunal, and his betrayal had prompted a complete review of all civilian personnel with base access. In some ways, the attack had made the base more secure than it had ever been before. When Sarah entered Henderson's office, she found him standing by the window, looking out over the training grounds. He turned as she closed the door behind her and gestured for her to sit. Instead of taking his position behind the desk, he sat in the chair next to her. A gesture that immediately told Sarah this was not a standard military briefing. Henderson held a folder in his hands, but he didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed pride with something else, perhaps concern or regret. "How are you doing, Mitchell?" And I want an honest answer, not the standard "fine, sir" that soldiers give their commanding officers. Sarah took a moment to consider her response. "I'm managing, sir. Some days are harder than others. I still have dreams about it. Wake up sometimes thinking I'm back in that armory, but Dr. Chen says that's normal and it's getting better." Henderson nodded slowly. "Good. I'm glad you're working with Dr. Chen. Too many soldiers think asking for help is a sign of weakness. It's not. It's a sign of intelligence." He paused, then opened the folder. "I've called you here because there are several matters we need to discuss regarding your future." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. The word future could mean many things in a military context, not all of them positive. "First," Henderson continued, "I want you to know that the man you struck in the throat survived. He's facing multiple charges and will spend the rest of his life in a military prison, but he lived. I thought you would want to know that." Relief flooded through Sarah so intensely that she felt momentarily dizzy. She had been carrying the weight of possibly having killed someone, and while Henderson's earlier words about justified action had helped, nothing compared to knowing that the man would live. "Thank you for telling me, sir. That means more than you know." "I figured it might," Henderson said with a slight smile. "Second, your actions in the armory have not gone unnoticed at the highest levels of command. Multiple generals have reviewed the incident reports and the security footage. What you did, Mitchell, has become a case study in effective close-quarters combat and crisis response. Military academies are already incorporating your tactics into their training programs." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The idea of her desperate fight becoming a teaching tool felt strange, almost surreal. She had acted on instinct and training, not with any thought of creating a model for others to follow. Henderson seemed to sense her discomfort and continued. "I know you didn't do it for recognition, but recognition is coming anyway, whether you want it or not. The Secretary of Defense is recommending you for the Soldier's Medal for your actions. There will be a ceremony in 6 weeks. The Soldier's Medal was one of the highest honors a soldier could receive for non-combat heroism." Sarah had seen the ceremony for other recipients, had stood in formation applauding their courage. She had never imagined being on the receiving end of such recognition. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Those other soldiers in the armory, they helped too once I made the first move." "They did," Henderson agreed, "and several of them are receiving commendations as well. But you were the catalyst, Mitchell. You saw the danger, assessed the situation, and acted when action was required. Leadership isn't always about rank or position. Sometimes it's about having the courage to move when everyone else is frozen." Sarah absorbed this, thinking about that moment in the armory, when she had grabbed the communication device and made the decision to act. It had felt less like courage and more like necessity, as if there was no other choice available. But perhaps that was what real courage felt like in the moment. Not a grand heroic feeling, but simply doing what needed to be done. "There's more," Henderson said, his tone becoming more serious. "Your performance has attracted attention beyond just commendations. Several special operations units have expressed interest in recruiting you. The intelligence community has also made inquiries. You have options now, Mitchell. Opportunities that most soldiers never get." This was unexpected. Sarah had been content with her role in her current unit, had never sought advancement or special assignments, but she couldn't deny a flicker of interest at the possibilities Henderson was describing. Special operations, intelligence work. These were areas where her skills could be used in ways that might prevent situations like the armory attack from happening in the first place. What kind of opportunities? Sarah asked carefully. Henderson pulled several documents from the folder and laid them on the small table between their chairs. This one is from Delta Force. They're looking for soldiers with your combination of tactical thinking and combat skills. This one is from Military Intelligence, interested in your ability to read situations and make split-second decisions. And this one, he tapped a document with a heavily redacted header, is from a unit that doesn't officially exist, doing work that will never appear in any public record. Sarah looked at the documents, her mind racing. Each represented a completely different path, different challenges, different ways to serve. Part of her wanted to stay exactly where she was, in the familiar environment of her current unit. But another part, the part that had driven her to join the military in the first place, was intrigued by these new possibilities. You don't have to decide today, Henderson said. These offers will remain open for several months. But I want you to think seriously about them. You have talents that could be used in many ways, Mitchell. The question is how you want to use them. Sarah nodded, still processing the information. May I ask what you think I should do, sir? Henderson leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. I think you should do whatever allows you to look at yourself in the mirror and be proud of who you see. Don't chase glory or rank or recognition. Chase purpose. Figure out what kind of soldier you want to be, what kind of impact you want to have, and then choose the path that gets you there. It was good advice, the kind that comes from years of experience and hard-won wisdom. Sarah appreciated that Henderson wasn't trying to push her in any particular direction, but was instead encouraging her to think deeply about her own values and goals. There's one more thing, Henderson said, pulling out a final document. This is a request from the training command. They want you to develop a hand-to-hand combat program based on your techniques, not to replace existing training, but to supplement it with real-world scenarios and responses. They're particularly interested in teaching soldiers how to fight effectively when they've lost their primary weapons. Sarah took the document and scanned it quickly. The request was detailed, outlining a proposed 6-week intensive course that would train soldiers in the kind of close-quarters combat she had used in the armory. The idea of teaching others, of passing on knowledge that might save lives someday, appealed to her in a way the other opportunities didn't. I'd like to do this, Sarah said, looking up at Henderson. Regardless of what else I decide, I want to do this training program. Henderson smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since the incident. I was hoping you'd say that. I already told them you would probably accept. We can start developing the curriculum next month once your ribs are fully healed. They talked for another 30 minutes about logistics, timelines, and expectations. As the meeting drew to a close, Henderson stood and extended his hand. When Sarah shook it, he held her grip for a moment longer than necessary. You did good, Mitchell. Better than good. You reminded everyone on this base what it means to be a soldier. To put the welfare of your unit above your own safety. Don't let the attention or the opportunities change who you are at your core. Sarah left Henderson's office with her mind full of possibilities and questions. The base looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Soldiers going about their duties, vehicles moving between buildings, the constant low hum of military activity. But Sarah's perspective had shifted. She wasn't just a soldier following orders anymore. She was someone whose actions had consequences that rippled outward, affecting training programs and recruitment and the careers of other soldiers. That evening, Sarah went for a long walk around the base perimeter, something she did when she needed to think. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She thought about the offers Henderson had presented, each one representing a different future. Delta Force would mean more combat, more danger, more intensity. Intelligence work would mean less physical action, but more strategic thinking. The mysterious redacted unit intrigued her precisely because she knew so little about it. But it was the training program that... 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in her dress uniform on a stage in front of hundreds of soldiers, dignitaries, and press representatives. The medal ceremony was being held in the base's largest assembly hall, and every seat was filled. Sarah's hands were sweating despite the air conditioning, and she kept her face neutral even as her heart pounded in her chest. This kind of public attention was far more terrifying than facing 5 armed intruders had been. The Secretary of Defense, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, stepped to the podium. The room fell silent as she began to speak. Today we honor extraordinary courage displayed in the face of overwhelming danger. Specialist Sarah Mitchell exemplified the very best qualities of military service when she single-handedly prevented a catastrophic security breach that could have cost many lives. Sarah stood at attention, listening as the secretary recounted the events in the armory. Hearing someone else describe what had happened made it seem both more real and more distant at the same time, as if the secretary was talking about a different person entirely. But the weight of the medal as it was placed around her neck was very real, solid and heavy against her chest. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Sarah was expected to shake hands and accept congratulations from a seemingly endless line of people. Generals praised her. Fellow soldiers looked at her with respect and admiration. Journalists asked questions that she deflected with practiced ease, having been coached by the base's public affairs officers on what she could and couldn't say about the incident. Through it all, Sarah kept thinking about the conversation she'd had with Dr. Chen the previous day. The psychologist had asked her how she felt about becoming a symbol, about being held up as an example of military excellence. Sarah had admitted that it made her uncomfortable, that she didn't feel like a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. Dr. Chen had smiled and said that was exactly why Sarah was the right person to be receiving the medal, because she understood that heroism wasn't about seeking glory but about serving others. Among the people at the reception, Sarah was most pleased to see Sergeant Price. His shoulder had healed well and he was back to full duty. He approached her with a genuine smile and a firm handshake. "How does it feel to be famous, Mitchell?" "Exhausting," Sarah admitted quietly. "I'll be glad when all this is over and I can get back to normal duty." Price laughed. "I hate to break it to you, but normal duty is never coming back. You've set a new standard, and everyone is going to be measuring themselves against what you did. That's your legacy now, whether you want it or not." His words proved prophetic. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began developing the hand-to-hand combat training program she had agreed to create. She worked with experienced instructors and combat veterans to design a curriculum that was both practical and comprehensive. The program focused on scenarios where soldiers might find themselves without their primary weapons, teaching them to use whatever was available, including their own bodies, to defend themselves and their units. The first pilot class of the program began 3 months after the armory incident. 20 soldiers from various units had been selected to participate, a mix of experienced veterans and promising newer soldiers. On the first day, Sarah stood in front of them in the training facility, feeling a different kind of nervousness than she'd felt at the medal ceremony. These soldiers were looking to her for knowledge and guidance, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. "This program isn't about turning you into action heroes," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "It's about giving you tools to survive when everything goes wrong. In combat, nothing ever goes according to plan. Equipment fails, weapons malfunction. You get separated from your unit. This training is for those moments when your rifle is gone, and all you have left is your mind and your body." Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah pushed the trainees harder than they had ever been pushed before. She taught them not just techniques but principles, how to read a situation and adapt, how to use leverage instead of strength, how to maintain calm under pressure. She shared stories from her own experience, including the armory incident, not to glorify what she had done, but to illustrate the mental processes that had guided her decisions. The trainees responded with enthusiasm and dedication. They saw in Sarah someone who had proven the value of the skills she was teaching. She wasn't asking them to do anything she hadn't done herself. This authenticity gave her teaching a credibility that no amount of theoretical knowledge could have provided. During the training program, Sarah also continued her sessions with Dr. Chen. The psychologist helped her work through the lingering effects of the trauma, the occasional nightmares, the moments of hypervigilance when entering new spaces. Slowly but steadily, Sarah was integrating the experience into her sense of self without letting it define her completely. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing training materials in her office, she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in civilian clothes knocked on her open door. She appeared to be in her early 20s with dark hair and nervous eyes. "Specialist Mitchell? My name is Amy Torres. I'm Private Torres's younger sister." Sarah remembered Private Torres, the young soldier who had thanked her after the armory incident.
She gestured for Amy to come in and take a seat.
"What can I do for you?" Amy sat down, her hands twisting in her lap. "My brother told me what you did, how you saved everyone in that armory. I wanted to meet you because I'm thinking about joining the military, but I wasn't sure if women could really be as effective as men in combat roles. My dad keeps telling me I should pick a support position, something safe. But after hearing what you did, I started thinking maybe I could be more than that." Sarah looked at this young woman, seeing in her the same uncertainty and determination she had felt years earlier when she first joined. "Can I ask you something? Why do you want to join the military?" Amy thought for a moment. "I want to serve. I want to be part of something bigger than myself. And I want to prove that I'm capable of more than people think I am." "Those are good reasons," Sarah said, "but you need to understand something important. What I did in that armory wasn't about being a woman proving herself against men. It was about being a trained soldier doing my job. Your gender doesn't determine your capability. Your training, your dedication, and your willingness to push yourself beyond your limits, that's what determines your capability." They talked for over an hour. Sarah shared her own journey through military training, the struggles and triumphs, the moments of doubt and the moments of clarity. She was honest about the challenges women faced in male-dominated military roles. But she was also clear that those challenges were worth overcoming. By the time Amy left, she seemed more confident, more certain of her decision to enlist. After Amy left, Sarah sat quietly in her office, thinking about the conversation. She realized that her role was evolving beyond just being a soldier, or even just being an instructor. She was becoming an example, a possibility, proof that women could serve at the highest levels of military combat if given the opportunity and training. It was a responsibility she had never sought, but one she was beginning to accept. The training program concluded with a final exercise that tested everything the trainees had learned. They were placed in scenarios designed to simulate real-world situations where they would need to fight without their primary weapons. Sarah watched as they applied the principles she had taught them, adapting to changing circumstances, working together, never giving up even when exhausted. At the graduation ceremony for the program, Colonel Henderson gave a speech praising both Sarah's teaching and the trainees' dedication. "What you've learned here could save your lives someday," he told the graduating class. "More importantly, it could save the lives of your fellow soldiers. Specialist Mitchell has given you a gift. The gift of knowledge earned through experience and refined through discipline. Use it wisely, use it well, and pass it on to others." After the ceremony, Henderson pulled Sarah aside. "I've received feedback from the trainees and the other instructors. Everyone agrees that this program is invaluable. The command wants to make it a permanent part of our training curriculum, with you as the primary instructor. They're also talking about expanding it to other bases." Sarah felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. This program, born from the worst day of her life, was going to help soldiers across multiple bases. Lives would be saved because of what she was teaching. It was a legacy worth having. "There's something else," Henderson continued. "Those special operations offers I mentioned before, they're still on the table. You could take this program to even more elite units, train the very best soldiers in the military. Or you could stay here, build the program, make it something that outlasts both of us. The choice is yours." Sarah thought about the offers, about the different paths her career could take. Delta Force would be exciting, challenging, a chance to operate at the highest levels of military capability. Intelligence work would let her use her mind in ways she had never explored. But staying here, building this program, teaching soldiers who would go on to teach others, that felt like the right choice. "I want to stay," Sarah said firmly. "I want to build